12-year-old girl wakes up with a minor cold. Her parents give her a single, extra-strength painkiller. Hours later, she is dead. Within days, several more people collapse under identical, terrifying circumstances. Someone is lacing capsules with cyanide and quietly returning them to store shelves. The CEO of a massive pharmaceutical empire now faces a chilling reality. His most trusted product has just become a murder weapon. It is a quiet, dreary Wednesday morning in the American Midwest. The rain is hitting the pavement outside. Inside a warm, ordinary suburban home, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman wakes up feeling awful. She has a sore throat and a runny nose, just a minor, completely routine autumn cold. She walks into the bathroom. Her parents, wanting to ease her discomfort before the school day begins, give her a single extra-strength painkiller. It is a bright red and white capsule. The brand is Tylenol. It is the most trusted, ubiquitous household medicine in the country. Mary swallows the capsule with a glass of water. Minutes later, Mary's father hears a loud thud from the bathroom. He calls her name. There is no response. He pushes the door open and finds his 12-year-old daughter lying on the floor, completely unresponsive. Paramedics arrive within moments. They load her into the ambulance, their sirens piercing the quiet morning commute. But there is nothing they can do. By the time Mary reaches the hospital, she is pronounced dead. The doctors are completely baffled. A perfectly healthy child does not simply drop dead from a minor cold. They suspect a stroke, perhaps a hidden congenital heart defect. What they do not know, what no one could possibly know yet, is that Mary did not die of natural causes. Just a few miles away, 27-year-old Adam Janis, a postal worker, is taking the day off. He is feeling a bit under the weather. His chest aches. He walks into his kitchen, opens a new bottle of extra-strength Tylenol he had just picked up from the local supermarket, and takes 2 capsules. He walks into his bedroom to rest. Minutes later, he collapses. The exact same frantic scenario plays out. The ambulance ride, the desperate doctors, the flatlining heart monitor. Adam is pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the emergency room. The hospital staff suspects a massive catastrophic heart attack. It is unusual for a healthy 27-year-old, but not medically impossible. By that evening, Adam's family gathers at his home to mourn. The shock is unimaginable. Adam's brother, Stanley, and his sister-in-law, Teresa, are reeling from the grief. The emotional toll is physically exhausting. Their heads are pounding. Looking for relief, Stanley spots the open bottle of Tylenol sitting on the kitchen counter, the exact same bottle Adam had opened just hours earlier. Stanley takes a capsule. He hands one to Teresa. Within minutes, Stanley collapses to the floor. As family members scream and rush to his side, Teresa suddenly seizes and collapses right next to him. 3 healthy adults, all from the same family, are now dead within the span of a few hours. The local medical community is thrown into a state of absolute panic. Is it a highly contagious virus? An environmental hazard? A gas leak? The local police and health inspectors comb through the Janis home. They test the air, the water, the food in the refrigerator. Nothing but 2 off-duty firefighters, working independently, start to notice a tiny, almost invisible thread. They hear the radio chatter about the Kellerman girl in the morning and the Janis family in the evening. They compare notes. In both homes, sitting right out in the open, was a recently purchased bottle of extra-strength Tylenol. They take the bottles to a toxicologist. The lab opens the remaining red and white capsules. They don't smell like medicine. They emit a faint, bitter scent, the scent of bitter almonds. Inside those capsules was not a painkiller, but potassium cyanide, and it was not a small dose. Each laced capsule contained roughly 10,000 times the lethal amount needed to kill a human being. To understand how horrifying this is, you have to understand what cyanide actually does to the human body. It is not just a poison, it is a chemical suffocation. When potassium cyanide enters the bloodstream, it actively prevents the body's cells from using oxygen. Your lungs can be full of fresh, clean air. Your heart can be pumping furiously, but your internal organs are violently starving to death. The central nervous system completely shuts down within minutes. It is rapid, it is brutal, and it is almost impossible to reverse. Someone in the Chicago area has deliberately hollowed out ordinary painkiller capsules, filled them with a military-grade toxin, reassembled them, and placed them back on supermarket shelves. The ultimate invisible trap. And as the sun sets on September 29th, authorities realize a terrifying truth. They have no idea how many more poisoned bottles are sitting in medicine cabinets across the country, waiting for someone to get a headache. To understand the sheer terror that is about to grip the United States, you have to understand the absolute, unshakable trust the American consumer has in the year 1982. When you walk into a grocery store with a headache, you do not question the safety of the products on the shelves. You walk down the pharmacy aisle, past the brightly colored cardboard boxes, and you pick up a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol. You trust the brand. You trust the store. You trust that the medicine inside is exactly what the label says it is. The killer understands this trust perfectly, and they weaponize it. The exact movements of the killer are still unknown to this day, but forensic experts and behavioral profilers know exactly how the mechanics of this crime have to work. The killer does not strike in a dark alley. They do not use a firearm. They use patience, precision, and the vulnerabilities of modern manufacturing. The killer acquires several bottles of extra-strength Tylenol from local pharmacies. They take them back to a secure, private location, perhaps a basement, perhaps a quiet kitchen table. In the early 80s, opening a bottle of over-the-counter medicine is effortlessly simple. There is no tightly wound plastic shrink wrap securing the cap to the neck of the bottle. There is no impenetrable aluminum foil seal heat welded over the opening. There are no child-proof safety locks requiring you to push down and twist simultaneously. You simply unscrew the red plastic cap. Inside the neck of the bottle rests a single fluffy white cotton ball that is the only line of defense between the medicine and the outside world. The killer plucks the cotton out and sets it aside. They pour the red and white capsules onto their workspace. The killer meticulously pulls the gelatin capsules apart. They empty out the harmless acetaminophen powder. In its place, they pour in a heavy granular dose of potassium cyanide. It requires a steady hand. The cyanide is highly toxic. Even inhaling the dust in a confined space could be fatal. Once the lethal dose is inside, the killer simply presses the two halves of the capsule back together. They slide with a quiet, satisfying click. The tampered pills are dropped back into the plastic bottle. The cotton ball is pushed back into the neck. The red cap is screwed tightly shut. The bottle is slipped back into its cardboard box. It looks entirely untouched. Factory perfect. Now comes the most brazen part of the operation. The killer must return the weapon to the battlefield. They walk back into the brightly lit, bustling supermarkets of the Chicago suburbs. They do not look like an assassin. They blend in completely. They are a ghost walking through the aisles when no one is looking. Perhaps when a clerk turns to restock a lower shelf, or when a mother turns to scold her child, the killer reaches out. They place the compromised, lethal bottles right at the front of the display, at eye level, waiting patiently for the next person with a fever, a joint ache, or a minor cold. Back at the medical examiner's office, the realization of what is happening hits the investigators like a physical blow. As the bodies of the victims are brought in, the police quickly secure the Tylenol bottles found in their homes. Initially, the authorities pray for a simple, albeit tragic, explanation. They assume this must be a catastrophic manufacturing error, perhaps a disgruntled employee at a Johnson & Johnson factory purposefully tainted a massive mixing vat. But when the investigators check the lot numbers printed on the side of the lethal bottles, their blood runs cold. The numbers do not match. These specific bottles were manufactured in entirely different facilities. One was bottled in Pennsylvania, the other in Texas. They were produced weeks, possibly months apart. There is zero mathematical possibility that this contamination happened at the factory. This means the poison was introduced at the retail level. Someone physically walked into a Jewel Osco on one side of town, an Osco drug on the other, and a Walgreens in the next county over. The implications are paralyzing. If it had been a factory error, the government could simply issue a localized recall for that specific batch number. The threat could be contained. But this is randomized, manual sabotage. There is no geographic pattern. There is no specific target profile. The victims are completely unconnected. The killer is playing a game of nationwide Russian roulette, and they are using the American supply chain to spin the cylinder. The authorities have absolutely no fingerprints. They have no suspects. They have no motive. They only have a terrifying statistic. There are roughly 31 million bottles of Tylenol currently sitting on store shelves and inside medicine cabinets across the United States, and nobody in the country knows how many of them have been quietly transformed into murder weapons. A 1,000 miles away from the wailing ambulance sirens and the panicked emergency rooms of Chicago, the atmosphere inside the Johnson & Johnson headquarters is a picture of absolute corporate tranquility. It is the morning of September 30th. Executives in tailored wool suits walk across plush carpets. Secretaries quietly type on IBM Selectric typewriters. Millions of dollars are being calculated, projected, and secured. At the very top of this hierarchy sits the Chief Executive Officer, James Burke. He is a man who understands the deep psychology of American consumerism. He has spent his life building brands, and he knows that the ultimate currency a company possesses is not cash but trust. And right now, his company holds the absolute highest reserve of trust in the world. Tylenol is not just a successful product, it is an absolute juggernaut. It controls a staggering 37% of the over-the-counter painkiller market. It outsells Bayer, Bufferin, and Anacin combined. It is so profitable that this single brand accounts for nearly 1/5 of Johnson & Johnson's total global profits. But down the hall from Burke's executive suite, the medical director's heavy rotary phone begins to ring. On the other end of the line is a toxicologist from the Cook County Medical Examiner's office in Chicago. The conversation is brief, chaotic, and terrifying. The medical director slams the phone down. He sprints down the carpeted hallway, bypassing the secretaries, and bursts into Burke's office. He delivers a sentence that no CEO in history has ever had to hear. People are dying, and our pills are the murder weapon. Within minutes, a corporate war room is hastily assembled. Top-tier lawyers, public relations directors, and manufacturing engineers are dragged out of their routine morning meetings. The initial reaction inside the room is absolute, furious denial. It is a sheer psychological defense mechanism. The executives insist that the reports coming out of Chicago must be a mistake. It has to be a counterfeit operation. Someone is printing fake labels and selling fake pills. The head of manufacturing is pulled in. He spreads the blueprints of the Tylenol production facilities across the table. He violently taps his finger on the schematics, explaining the strict sterile flow of the assembly lines in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania, and Round Rock, Texas. He proves definitively that potassium cyanide is not used in any part of their manufacturing process. It is not on the premises. It is not in the mixing vats. It is not in the gelatin capsules. A collective, albeit brief, sigh of relief washes over the boardroom. If the poison wasn't put there by Johnson & Johnson, then they are not legally liable. It is a local police issue, a tragic, isolated anomaly. But then, the lot numbers are read aloud from the police report. Pause for a second and think about the sheer logistical horror of what these two lot numbers, MC2880 and 1910MD, actually mean. If all the poisoned bottles came from one batch, the executives could simply point to a single rogue employee at one specific factory. They could isolate the threat, but these bottles were manufactured in two entirely different states, at two entirely different times. Yet they ended up poisoned in the exact same suburban county. This is the sudden, terrifying twist that shifts this from a corporate crisis into a nationwide horror story. It means the poison wasn't introduced at the manufacturing plant. The company has absolutely zero control over where the killer will strike next. The infiltration is happening at the very end of the line, in the completely unguarded, easily accessible retail aisles of everyday supermarkets. The blood drains from the faces of the executives. The realization hits them like a physical shockwave. The killer is completely invisible, utilizing the massive, sprawling American supply chain to do their dirty work. And then, the phones in the war room start ringing, all at once. The news has officially broken on national television. The story leads every single midday broadcast across the United States. Panic spreads faster than the cyanide itself. Police switchboards in every major city are completely jammed by terrified citizens who have just swallowed a painkiller for a morning headache and are now convinced they have minutes left to live. Inside the war room, the financial monitors tell a brutal, unvarnished story. Wall Street reacts with ruthless efficiency. The stock of Johnson & Johnson enters a total freefall. In a matter of hours, the company's market value drops by hundreds of millions of dollars. The golden goose is dying right in front of them. The brand name that James Burke spent years elevating is suddenly transforming into a global synonym for sudden death. The lawyers and the public relations experts start shouting over each other. The room is a cacophony of fear and strategy. The PR team insists on issuing a localized warning. Tell only the people of Chicago not to take the pills. The lawyers argue against admitting any direct fault, terrified of the impending wave of multi-million-dollar lawsuits that could bankrupt the entire corporation. They advise Burke to stay quiet, let the FBI handle it, and weather the storm. James Burke stands at the head of the mahogany table, looking out the window at the quiet, peaceful streets of New Brunswick. He realizes that the corporate playbook sitting on the table behind him is completely useless. If he listens to the lawyers, he might save the stock price for a day, but he will permanently destroy the soul of his company. He turns back to the room. The shouting stops. The executives wait for their orders. The fate of a billion-dollar empire and potentially thousands of American lives now rests entirely on what Burke decides to do next. The atmosphere inside the New Brunswick war room is thick with cigarette smoke and absolute dread. The initial shock has worn off, replaced by the brutal, calculating reality of corporate survival. Dozens of highly paid executives are now staring at a multi-million-dollar catastrophe. They have to respond, and they have to respond immediately. But the room is fractured into two distinct warring factions. On one side of the mahogany table sit the corporate lawyers. Their job is not to manage public health. Their job is to protect the company from fatal liability. They look at the spreading panic across the country and see thousands of potential lawsuits materializing out of thin air. Their advice to CEO James Burke is aggressive and clear: contain the narrative. They argue vehemently that Johnson & Johnson must only issue a regional recall, pull the bottles from the Chicago area, and leave the rest of the country alone. If the company initiates a massive nationwide recall of 31 million bottles, the lawyers argue, it will be viewed in a court of law as a tacit admission of guilt. It will signal to the American public and to hungry prosecutors that the company believes their manufacturing process is fundamentally flawed. If you pull a bottle off a shelf in California when the murders happened in Illinois, you are effectively telling a jury that you knew the California bottle was dangerous too. On the other side of the table sit the financial and public relations directors. They are staring at the plummeting stock ticker. They remind Burke of the math. Tylenol represents roughly 19% of the entire corporation's profit. A nationwide recall means physically rounding up and destroying over $100 million of retail inventory in a single afternoon. It is financial suicide. The PR experts point to the standard corporate crisis manual. The manual dictates a strict, methodical approach. You wait for the facts. You do not panic the public. You issue localized, calm warnings. You shift the blame to external factors, and you ride out the news cycle. The standard corporate playbook demands that a company protects its stock price above all else. James Burke listens to the shouting. He looks at the legal pads, the financial projections, and the crisis manuals. And then he mentally discards all of it. Burke realizes a fundamental truth that the lawyers and accountants are entirely missing. They are treating this like a defective product issue. They are treating it like a bad batch of plastic or a misprinted label. But this is not a defect. It is an active, ongoing act of terrorism. He visualizes the physical reality of the product. He thinks about the simple twist-off plastic cap, the fluffy white cotton ball. He realizes that the killer has turned the absolute trust of the American consumer into a loaded weapon. If Johnson & Johnson follows the corporate playbook, they are actively leaving millions of potential landmines on store shelves, waiting for a mother to treat a fever or a worker to treat a backache. Trust is not a line item on a spreadsheet. Once it is broken, no amount of legal maneuvering will ever buy it back. The shouting in the war room slowly dies down. All eyes turn to the head of the table. Burke stands up. He makes a decision that defies every established rule of Wall Street. He orders the immediate, total, nationwide recall of all extra-strength Tylenol capsules, every single bottle, in every single pharmacy, supermarket, and gas station in the United States. He doesn't stop there. He picks up the telephone and orders the immediate shutdown of all Tylenol capsule manufacturing plants. He then orders the immediate suspension of all Tylenol television and print advertising. He sends thousands of Johnson & Johnson sales representatives out into the streets, driving to individual stores to physically strip the bottles from the shelves themselves. The immediate financial fallout is apocalyptic. The stock takes another terrifying dive. Competitors like Anison and Bayer immediately ramp up their own production, salivating at the chance to devour Tylenol's massive market share. Prominent Wall Street analysts go on national television and confidently declare the brand legally, financially, and culturally dead. They state that the name Tylenol will forever be synonymous with cyanide and death. No one will ever swallow one of those pills again. James Burke has just willfully burned his own golden goose to the ground to prevent another casualty. He has chosen human life over corporate survival. But as the 31 million bottles begin their long journey back to the incinerators, a chilling reality sets in. Destroying the product does not catch the person who poisoned it. The ghost in the aisles is still out there, and tomorrow they are going to send a letter. The physical threat is rapidly being eliminated. Across the country, massive industrial furnaces roar to life, incinerating over 31 million bottles of Tylenol. James Burke has successfully pulled the weapon off the battlefield, but destroying the remaining inventory does not solve the fundamental mystery. The ghost in the aisles is still out there, and the American public is terrified. A massive, unprecedented task force is assembled in Chicago. It consists of over 100 agents from the FBI, the local police, and the state authorities. They commandeer a massive office space and turn it into a war room. The sheer scale of the investigation is almost impossible to comprehend. They log over 20,000 individual leads. They process thousands of tips from panicked citizens. Investigators visit every single pharmacy and grocery store in the Chicago suburbs. They interview cashiers, stock boys, and store managers. They dig through the trash, looking for discarded receipts. They review grainy, low-quality security camera footage, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone tampering with the displays. They find absolutely nothing. Pause for a moment and think about the absolute nightmare facing these investigators. Imagine searching for a ghost who leaves no fingerprints, has no specific victim profile, and uses a weapon you can buy at literally any corner shop with cash. There is no murder weapon left at the scene. There is no bloody trail. There is no getaway car. Where do you even begin looking for a killer who was never actually in the room with their victims? The investigation is hitting a massive brick wall. And then, the mail arrives at Johnson & Johnson headquarters. It is a single, typewritten letter. It contains a chilling, direct threat. The author claims full responsibility for the cyanide murders in Chicago. They state that the killings will continue unless Johnson & Johnson wires exactly $1 million to a specific bank account. For the FBI, this is the holy grail. The invisible killer has finally made a tangible demand. They have stepped out of the shadows and left a digital footprint. Agents immediately trace the bank account number provided in the extortion letter. The account belongs to an individual named Frederick McCaig, but when the FBI tracks down McCaig, they realize he has absolutely nothing to do with the murders. His account had simply been used as a drop by someone else, a man with a long, shady history of financial crimes, a man named James Lewis. James Lewis is a tax consultant and an occasional grifter. When investigators dig into his past, they discover a deeply disturbing profile. Years earlier, in Missouri, Lewis had been charged with the gruesome murder of an elderly client. The charges were ultimately dropped due to a police technicality, but the implication hangs heavily over the task force. They have a suspect with a history of extreme violence, an intimate knowledge of financial routing, and a motive driven by pure greed. The manhunt kicks into high gear. Warrants are issued. The FBI publicly names James Lewis as the prime suspect in the Tylenol murders. His face is plastered across every newspaper and television screen in the nation. But Lewis does not lay low. He revels in the attention. He is a phantom, moving rapidly across state lines, utilizing fake IDs and paying only in cash. He actively taunts the FBI. He sends letters to the Chicago Tribune, mocking the authorities for their inability to catch him. He treats the largest criminal investigation in American history like a personal game of chess. The chase lasts for an agonizing 2 months. The public is desperate for closure. Then, in December of 1982, a breakthrough. A librarian working at a public library in Manhattan recognizes a patron. He is sitting quietly at a reading table, flipping through a newspaper. She quietly steps into a back office and dials the authorities. The FBI swoops in. They surround the building and arrest James Lewis without a shot being fired. The entire country breathes a massive sigh of relief. The Tylenol killer has finally been captured. The nightmare is over. Except it isn't. When the FBI brings Lewis into the interrogation room, they begin comparing his travel records against the timeline of the poisonings. They pull his flight logs, his hotel receipts, and his employment history, and a devastating truth slowly begins to emerge. During the exact window of time when the cyanide-laced bottles were being quietly placed onto the supermarket shelves in the Chicago suburbs, James Lewis was not in Illinois. He was hundreds of miles away in New York City. His alibi is completely bulletproof. He did not poison the capsules. He did not murder the 7 victims. James Lewis is not a criminal mastermind. He is a vulture. He is simply a grifter who saw a horrific national tragedy unfolding on the evening news and decided to exploit the panic to make a quick $1 million. He wrote the extortion letter, banking on the chaos. The FBI has their extortionist. They send Lewis to federal prison for a decade. But as the interrogation room empties, the cold, paralyzing reality settles back over the task force. The real killer, the person who actually crushed the cyanide and walked through the grocery store aisles, is still a complete unknown. The greatest manhunt in FBI history has just hit a dead end, and CEO James Burke realizes that if the authorities cannot catch the killer, his company must find a way to completely re-engineer reality itself to make sure they can never strike again. The manhunt has hit a dead end. James Lewis, the extortionist, is sitting in a federal cell, but the FBI quietly admits that the real killer, the person who actually slipped the cyanide into the capsules, is still walking free. For Johnson & Johnson, the nightmare is entering a terrifying new phase. CEO James Burke has successfully destroyed 31 million bottles of his own product. He has stopped the immediate bleeding, but in doing so, he has created a massive, glaring void. Wall Street analysts are not just predicting a bad quarter, they are writing the absolute final obituary for the Tylenol brand. Before September 29th, the painkiller held a staggering 37% of the market. Now, just weeks later, it has plummeted to a devastating 7%. Focus groups and marketing experts deliver a brutal consensus. The American public will never ever put a Tylenol capsule in their mouths again. The name is permanently stained with the psychological terror of cyanide. The traditional corporate crisis playbook dictates a very specific strategy for this exact moment. Rebrand, change the name, change the box, quietly sweep the tragedy under the rug, and launch a new product to trick the consumer into forgetting the past. Burke completely rejects the playbook. He realizes that rebranding would be an act of supreme cowardice. It would mean the invisible killer had won. More importantly, it would mean betraying the millions of consumers who had trusted them for decades. If you hide from the public, they will assume you have something to hide. Burke decides to do something that corporate lawyers across America consider absolute professional suicide. He steps directly into the blinding light of the national media. Instead of hiding behind a wall of highly paid public relations executives and defensive legal jargon, the CEO goes on national television. He sits down for unscripted, highly hostile interviews on programs like 60 Minutes and The Phil Donahue Show. He holds massive, open press conferences, inviting the most aggressive investigative journalists in the country to ask him whatever they want. Watch the historical footage of these press conferences, and you are watching a masterclass in crisis management. Burke does not deflect blame. He does not minimize the tragedy. He does not offer hollow thoughts and prayers. He leans into the microphone and delivers raw, unvarnished transparency. He explicitly walks the American public through the exact horror of what happened. He holds up photos of the tampered bottles. He explains exactly how the killer bypassed their packaging. He answers every single terrifying question about the vulnerabilities of the American supply chain. When a reporter asks a hostile question about the company's plummeting stock price, Burke dismisses it instantly, stating flatly that the company's financial survival is entirely secondary to the physical safety of its customers. Behind the scenes, Burke weaponizes this transparency on a massive scale. He orders the creation of an unprecedented, nationwide 1-800 hotline. He doesn't staff it with automated messages or defensive lawyers. He staffs it with actual Johnson & Johnson employees. If a terrified mother in Ohio wants to know if the baby aspirin in her cabinet is safe, she can pick up the phone and talk to a human being. If a doctor in Seattle needs to know the exact lot numbers of the compromised batches, the hotline provides the raw data instantly. The company takes over 1 million phone calls in a matter of weeks. Burke takes it a step further. He buys millions of dollars in national advertising space, but he does not use it to sell a product. He uses the commercials to explicitly warn the American public not to buy Tylenol in capsule form. He offers to exchange any capsule currently sitting in a consumer's medicine cabinet for a solid tablet, entirely free of charge. Think about the psychological impact of that decision. A massive, profit-driven corporation is spending millions of dollars to go on television and beg you not to use their most profitable product. It is a radical, profound display of accountability, and it works. The American public, completely unaccustomed to seeing a massive corporation take a multi-million-dollar hit to protect the little guy, responds with something Wall Street analysts never predicted: empathy. The raw honesty disarms the panic. By taking absolute ownership of a crisis they didn't even start, Burke begins to rebuild the fractured trust of the nation, one household at a time. But talk is ultimately cheap. Transparency stops the bleeding, but it does not fix the physical vulnerability of the packaging. If Burke wants to actually put Tylenol back on the shelves, he cannot just change the narrative. He has to change the physical reality of how goods are sold on planet Earth, and his engineers have exactly 6 weeks to invent the solution from scratch. James Burke has successfully cleared every single bottle of Tylenol from the American market. The bleeding has stopped, but a terrifying void now exists. If Johnson & Johnson wants to survive, they cannot simply wait for the FBI to catch a ghost. They must redesign the physical reality of their product. They have to engineer a bottle that is absolutely unequivocally impenetrable without leaving obvious visual evidence of tampering, and they have exactly 6 weeks to do it. Before September 1982, the entire philosophy of consumer packaging is based on a single metric: extreme convenience. The easier a product is to open, the better it sells. If you have a pounding headache, you want the cap to slip off with zero friction. The engineers are now facing a massive, seemingly impossible contradiction. They must design a bottle that is intentionally difficult and frustrating to open, but still accessible enough for an elderly person suffering from arthritis. The design team realizes that a single barrier will never be enough. A determined killer will always find a way to bypass one lock. So, they decide to build a fortress. They need a system of redundant security layers. Walk into your bathroom and grab any bottle of over-the-counter medicine, a painkiller, a vitamin, cough syrup. Look at the plastic band wrapped tightly around the cap. Unscrew the lid and look at the silver foil stretched tightly over the opening. Every time you struggle to peel that foil back, every time you use your fingernail to break that plastic ring, you are interacting directly with the legacy of the Chicago cyanide crisis. That packaging exists in your home right now entirely because of the panic of 1982. The engineers get to work on the first line of defense, the cardboard box. Previously, the flaps of the box were lightly glued, making it easy to pry them open and slip them back together cleanly. The team reformulates the industrial adhesive. They mandate that all outer boxes must be heavily glued tight. If someone wants to get to the bottle inside, they have to physically tear the cardboard, destroying the pristine look of the box and leaving an immediate visual warning. Next, they tackle the bottle itself. The engineers introduce the shrink wrap band. They test dozens of different polymers until they find a specific plastic that reacts violently to heat. In the factory, a loose sleeve is dropped over the cap. The bottle passes through a heat tunnel, shrinking the plastic tight. It is branded with the company logo. If a saboteur tries to twist the cap, the plastic ring snaps and splinters. It cannot be glued back together. It cannot be seamlessly replaced. But the engineers know that plastic bands and glued cardboard are only deterrents. They need an absolute, impenetrable vault door guarding the medicine itself. They need an inner seal. Gluing a piece of foil to the top of a plastic bottle sounds simple in theory, but in the reality of mass production, it is a logistical nightmare. You cannot simply apply liquid glue to the rim of a bottle containing consumable medicine. The chemicals in the adhesive could leak, contaminating the pills and creating a completely different health crisis. The seal must be bonded without toxic adhesives, and it must hold so tightly that peeling it away leaves a ragged, visible rim of foil behind. To solve this, the engineers turn to a process known as electromagnetic induction sealing. The process is a masterclass in covert manufacturing. Inside the factory, the foil seal is actually placed inside the plastic cap before the cap is screwed onto the bottle. The foil is coated with a microscopic layer of dry, heat-sensitive polymer. Once the cap is screwed on tight, pressing the foil against the rim of the bottle, the entire unit passes directly underneath an induction coil. The coil emits an intense oscillating electromagnetic field. The magnetic field passes harmlessly through the plastic cap, but the moment it hits the aluminum foil inside, the metal acts as a resistor. In a fraction of a second, the foil intensely heats up. That flash of heat melts the polymer coating, fusing the aluminum directly to the plastic lip of the bottle. As it exits the magnetic field, it cools instantly, creating a permanent, airtight, hermetic seal. No liquid glue, no contamination. just pure physics binding metal to plastic. Developing the technology is only half the battle. Now Johnson & Johnson has to entirely rebuild their manufacturing infrastructure to accommodate these new machines. They tear apart their assembly lines in Pennsylvania and Texas. They run the factories around the clock, 24 hours a day, burning through millions of dollars in capital to retrofit the lines. By November, just 6 weeks after James Burke ordered the mass destruction of 31 million bottles, the machines roar back to life. The new bottles begin rolling off the line. They are an engineering triumph born from absolute necessity. They are boxed, sealed, and shipped back to the pharmacies and supermarkets of America. Burke has given the public the physical proof they need to trust the product again. The transparent packaging actively communicates safety. But as the new bottles arrive on store shelves, the dark shadow of the original crisis still looms. The packaging is fixed, the brand is saved, but the phantom who started it all is still out there, entirely untouched by the law. The new bottles arrive on store shelves just weeks after the crisis began. They are a physical manifestation of James Burke's radical transparency. Consumers walk into pharmacies, pick up the boxes, and physically struggle to open them. They have to tear the heavily glued cardboard. They have to snap the heat-shrunk plastic ring. They have to pierce the thick aluminum foil. Every layer of friction is a deliberate tactile reassurance that the medicine inside is completely safe. And the unthinkable happens. The American public rewards the honesty. Slowly but surely, the sales figures begin to climb. Within a year, Tylenol remarkably reclaims its position as the dominant painkiller in the country. James Burke is celebrated as the absolute gold standard for corporate leadership. He proved to a ruthless Wall Street that prioritizing human life over a quarterly earnings report isn't just a moral obligation, it is ultimately the most effective long-term business strategy. But beneath the surface of this massive corporate triumph, a terrifying unresolved darkness lingers. The company has fixed the packaging, but they haven't fixed the underlying vulnerability of the human condition. The massive joint task force in Chicago, the hundreds of federal agents, state police, and local detectives, is slowly disbanded. The tip lines stop ringing. The thousands of leads meticulously tracked on whiteboards all end in cold, dead alleys. James Lewis, the opportunistic extortionist, is sitting in a federal prison cell, but investigators know with absolute certainty that he is not the ghost who walked the aisles. Months turn into years. Years turn into decades. The person who carefully separated those red and white gelatin capsules, filled them with military-grade potassium cyanide, and placed them at eye level in suburban grocery stores, is never caught. They simply vanish back into the ordinary fabric of American life. Think about the psychological profile of an individual capable of pulling this off. They did not kill for money. They did not kill for political ideology. They killed completely at random, targeting innocent children and young parents alike, purely to inject maximum chaos into the system. And they succeeded beyond their wildest, most terrifying dreams. This unknown phantom forced a billion-dollar empire to its knees. They forced the authorities to incinerate 31 million bottles of medicine. They fundamentally altered global manufacturing laws and single-handedly redesigned the packaging of almost every consumable product on the planet. They watched their handiwork unfold on every television screen in the country, knowing that an army of the world's best investigators was hunting them. And then they just stopped. They walked away, leaving absolutely no trace behind. We are deeply, psychologically wired to expect a neat conclusion to our stories. When we watch a thriller or read a mystery, the final chapter always reveals the mastermind. The cuffs click around their wrists, and order is restored to the universe. But the cyanide crisis forces us to confront the most chilling reality of the real world. Sometimes the villain wins, sometimes pure, unadulterated evil commits a flawless crime and simply gets away with it. Today, the events of September 1982 echo in every single interaction we have with the physical goods we consume. The legacy of the Chicago Phantom is not just in the history books, it is in your kitchen pantry, your bathroom cabinet, and your refrigerator. Every time you hear the sharp snap of a plastic safety ring breaking on a bottle of water, every time you struggle to peel the foil off a new jar of peanut butter, every time you press the safety cap on a bottle of mouthwash to twist it open, you are actively participating in a daily subconscious ritual of paranoia born from this exact crisis. Before 1982, the world operated on a baseline assumption of absolute, unspoken trust. You trusted your neighbors. You trusted the local supermarket. You trusted the massive corporations that manufactured your medicine. You believed that a brightly lit pharmacy aisle was a completely safe haven. The cyanide crisis violently shattered that illusion, proving that our modern, highly industrialized society is incredibly fragile. It proved that the sprawling supply chains we rely on every single day are entirely unguarded at the very last mile. James Burke saved his company, and his engineers built a fortress around our medicine. But the profound, chilling legacy of the Tylenol murders is the permanent loss of our consumer innocence. We now live in a world where we accept that invisible predators might be walking the aisles right next to us. We check the seals not because we think the factory made a mistake, but because we know deep down that the ghost who got away proved it was entirely possible. And somewhere out there, the architect of the greatest unsolved crime in American history knows that every time you struggle to open a bottle, you are remembering exactly what they did.